Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ancient World Magazine podcast. Today's subject is networks and interconnectivity in the Mediterranean. As preparation for this episode, we've all been reading, or rereading, Cyprian Broodbank's book, The Making of the Middle Sea. We'll be talking extensively about this book. The team today consists of Josho, Matthew Lloyd and myself, Josho Brouwers. But we're also joined today by a very special guest, Dr. Lieve Donnellan. We'll introduce ourselves briefly.
I'm Lieve Donnellan. I'm assistant professor at University of Aarhus at the Department of Classical Archaeology. I work on networks in the Mediterranean and especially the first millennium BCE, so networks involving mobility of people, aka Greek colonization, as many people like to call it. Also the transformations that come out of these contacts and networks in the first millennium. So we're talking about urbanization, the rise of the first cities in Southern Europe, and also the economic and political transformations that go with these networks of mobility.
Josh?
I'm Joshua Hall, contributing editor here at Ancient World Magazine. And my interest in networks kind of overlaps with Lieve's. I'm interested in the first millennium BC in Italy, Sicily, and North Africa. And I'm more interested in the idea of networks of power and trying to use sociological theory and methods in analyzing both archaeological and historical evidence.
Matt?
I'm Matthew Lloyd. My research is on early Iron Age Greece. There's no real networks element to my research, but in teaching what we might call early Greece, but the period from about 1200 to 500 BCE, Mediterranean connectivity and Greeks spreading across the Mediterranean / being part of the Mediterranean world comes into all of that. So it's been sort of an important part of looking at archaic and earlier Greece.
My name is Josho Brouwers and I'm the editor of Ancient World Magazine, and I'm also an archaeologist. My research interest is in Greek warfare primarily back in the day. And I had a particular interest in elite networks, let's say, and also in the interconnectivity between the Aegean and the wider Mediterranean.
So Cyprian Broodbank's The Making of the Middle Sea is a hefty history published about 5 years ago on the early history of the Mediterranean. The background to this goes back to, as Broodbank himself discusses in his first chapter, goes back to the mid-20th century and the research of Fernand Braudel, who was one of the first scholars to put together this idea that the Mediterranean could be studied as a unit. So his first work on this is the Mediterranean and the Mediterranean world in the age of Philip II. That's Philip II of Spain, not the Philip II that Ancient World magazine readers might be familiar with. But yeah, that focused on broader ideas of history than the typical political and military basis of a lot of history at the time. He also, in the late 60s, wrote a manuscript for a book that in English is called The Mediterranean and the Ancient World, that wasn't published until 1998, that sort of forms a bit of the background to what Broodbank is doing, in that it does start very much at the beginning of the Mediterranean's existence as an entity, with the plates of Africa and Europe sort of coming together and forming this sea, and goes on until Charlemagne. It was published sort of 40 years after it was written, so it was already dated by that point, but it is quite a quick and interesting read, even if you know that it's sort of no longer relevant. But around the same time, in around 2000, Peregrine Horden and Nicholas Purcell produced another massive tome called The Corrupting Sea, which is fantastic in a lot of ways, but also very dense and difficult to read. And this idea of what they called the new thalassology sort of came about with reviving the study of the Mediterranean as a unit, particularly in the ancient world. And in his introduction, Broodbank talks about their focus being quite broad from the early first millennium to the 13th century AD, but he is sort of questioning how much further back can you go? How does this Mediterranean unit come together? And yeah, the idea of a network within that.
The major, or the starting point is the idea that the Mediterranean Sea serves as basically this thing that connects all the various shores.
It is really picking up where Brodel and also Horden and Purcell left off, I think, because Broodbank really starts with history of formation of the landscape, really from the beginning of times, quite literally, up till halfway in the first millennium before Christ, when he sees the unit of the Mediterranean arising, like the first fully formed network, Mediterranean network, that will only become denser through time with the Romans and then in medieval times where Brodel starts his study. So it is challenging in many ways. It's admirable in its detail. I don't think many people can repeat the exercise, mastering geology, the Paleolithic over Mesolithic, over Neolithic, the Near East, the Bronze Age. It's really, it's immense. So that is a challenge for the reader because it requires, I think, at least for me, a minimum of background that I only partially had. So I can imagine for the interested reader without a history or archaeology background, it is a challenge. Although I've met people who actually, without being an archaeologist or a historian, actually read the book from the beginning to the end and thought it was very interesting, very challenging. But it is, even for the researcher, I think, mind-blowing in the amount of detail and the amount of questions it raises. And well, reading through the parts I know best, so the first millennium BC, I have to say that Broodbank is up to date with many discussions, which is also admirable because the risk is that if people start writing about such an amount of data, including so much information, that they go way off topic and just miss the entire depth of current debates. But I think that he did it very well. It's really a masterpiece, and I think that the many prizes he earned with it are very well deserved.
I think you brought up one of the things that to me is most admirable about the book is that it is so very up to date with at least all of the discussions that I know, in that there are some subject-specific monographs that have been released in the last few years that I can think of on early Italy that are less up-to-date archaeologically than Broodbank is for Italy, even though he's covering the entirety of the Mediterranean. And it really is amazing how well he did.
Although he writes in his introduction that apparently some of the peer reviewers were not really keen on publishing this broad scoop. I mean, there are always people pro and against this kind of, let's say, broad volumes. I had a colleague whom I will not name by name, but saying like, how on earth can you treat the 6th century in Rome in just a couple of pages? Yes, of course, there's debate and discussion, a lot of research that lies behind the topics the book treats. But in the end, I think if no one even attempts to produce these kind of, let's say, summaries, in as far as you can call it a summary, I don't think anyone can ever produce one single view or advanced science, because a trend you see recently in academia is a lot of edited volumes and handbook on this and handbook on that, and many people contributing on producing these joint efforts of producing knowledge, which is good, but the fragmentation also prevents people from drawing historical conclusions, as subjective they might be. But I do think it is our job as historians and archaeologists to provide some kind of statement about how we think the world functioned in the past. You start working formulating new hypotheses.
We lose a lot if we only produce very narrow topical works, I think. And I think that's the value in a broad study like Broodbank's, is that, as specialists on different parts of the Mediterranean, we can actually see a much wider view of that world through books like this.
And I think we talk about, you sort of say, dealing with the 6th century of Rome in a couple of pages as an example. And it's like, well, there's lots of research dealing with the 6th century of Rome. And in his introduction, Broodbank does talk about this being a barbarian history. So, like Greece and Rome aren't excluded, there's a lot in here on Greece and Rome. But so much of what I got out of this volume, even in the chapters on the material I'm more familiar with, which are chapters 8, 9, and 10, broadly speaking, the late Bronze and early Iron Age, because they cover the whole Mediterranean, because you include North Africa and the Far West, you discover a lot more and find out a lot more about what's going on in places you don't know as well. And I don't need pages and pages on early Iron Age Greece, because I know that and know where else to find it, and there are plenty of other books where you can get that kind of detail. So you have this great scope that sort of brings in all the things that you wouldn't necessarily know were there. And that's both geographical and chronological, in that it goes back to 1.8 million years before the present with the sort of formation of the Mediterranean. And even in these early chapters, you sort of start to see things about the distribution of minerals within the basin that affects sort of why you need this connectivity, why you need to go between different places to get all the materials you need, especially for something like bronze, where you need to get copper from somewhere and tin from somewhere else, as one example. This goes back to the very beginning of the distribution of landscape and materials within this sea, within the basin.
For all the criticism some people may give to syntheses like this, it was introduced to me by James Whitley, who said, you need to read this book. And I think he was very right in telling me that back in 2013 when it was published.
Looking at this book, and it is huge and dense, but I think its chronological structure does mean that it is a lot easier to read than something like Horden and Purcell, who are thematically focused. And Horden and Purcell's book is definitely a book for specialists and researchers, and I was assigned it as an undergraduate, but only in pieces, because it's something you need to build up to reading cover to cover, which I still haven't done.
I continue to go back and back and back to it, reading and rereading, because it is so dense. Actually took me several years to digest the many ideas that are in there. But that also allows me gradually to, let's say, formulate my own critiques. And there is actually, if I may, despite all the praise and the admiration I have for Broodbank and Horden and Purcell, but I actually started my career as a Black Sea archaeologist. It's coming already. Where is the Black Sea in this narrative? And especially in the first millennium BC, the Black Sea enters the whole narrative of classical world, classical civilization. It's actually the beginning of the Silk Roads and the contacts with the Far East. And to be honest, I think this is a good dimension that has been overlooked in the search, and that should be included, because if you start looking at the actual idea of the Mediterranean as a unity, it was known in Roman times, Mare Nostrum was our sea, but the Greeks did not have a concept like that. And if you look at the frequently cited quote, frogs around the pond in Plato, that actually refers to the pillars of Hercules, so that's Spain, all over to Phasis, which is a far end of the Black Sea. So actually, the had a much broader concept from Spain to what is today Russia, not just Mediterranean. And that is a point I miss a little bit in current research and current trends on the Mediterranean. So it is something I believe we should think about.
Can that be related to political issues? Russian?
Yes, I think so, because obviously until the late 1980s, the Russian area or the whole Iron Curtain region was very difficult because it was a topic not studied or rarely studied in the West because of, well, not just the difficulties in language, but also the difficulties in accessing these countries could actually be dangerous in sometimes, not the least consequence was that you would gain some kind of reputation of having very left-wing sympathies, which obviously not everyone wanted to carry around with them in the department. So that makes that very few people until, let's say, the last couple of years actually studied the Black Sea intensively. And it's only, I think 1 or 2 decades that Black Sea studies have really expanded and became not even part of the curriculum of every university, but at least in some universities, study centers. So for example, here in Aarhus, there was a center until a couple of years ago specializing in Black Sea studies. And there are some other universities in France, in Germany, where the last 10 to 20 years, Black Sea studies were part of research programs and research projects. And that has already greatly expanded our knowledge about this very important area for at least the first millennium BCE, even though we can start thinking how far back this history goes. So that's actually a history book that has not yet been written. And that is going to pose a challenge for scholars to write, because it involves an even broader area, even more archaeology, even more languages than just the Mediterranean. So I think we will have to wait for quite some time before such a book is even going to be written.
And so the reverse process happening in the 90s as all these, if you look back at, I forgot his name, Beasley's studies of vase painting, the 4th century red figure gets quite hardly dealt with because it all looks terrible. Then in the 90s with the collapse of the Soviet Union, you suddenly have all these red figure vases that were in Soviet bloc countries becoming available, and it's like, oh, there are some good 4th century vase painting. Here it all is.
Well, they also had a lot of 5th century excellent vase painting, because they were one of the major consumers of Attic pottery, so the is really magnificent. Certain cities like Apollonia Pontica, Olbia, massive consumers of high quality painted vessels. So it is really a very interesting region to study. And I think the dynamics with the Mediterranean and the idea of uniting the Mediterranean should also involve this area. Which I think Horton and Purcell and Broodbank are becoming aware of that as well, especially with works on Silk Roads and more information we're getting from that area, and actually the expanding network. So the idea of globalization in antiquity, that not just the Mediterranean but the broader ancient world, coming the east to the west.
Yeah, and the Aegean can be considered sort of a transitionary zone, I guess, between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea area.
Exactly.
And of course, you have all these important cities like Troy and Constantinople, which are on the way into the Black Sea. That is, the importance of those cities is largely derived from the importance of this sea in its connection to the Aegean and Mediterranean.
Yeah, that's also why Athens in the classical period tries to colonize the Chrysonesos and Thrace and whatever in order to...
Really, that area is really the hub in a vastly expanding network. That is very obvious, and that's also one of the reasons that these cities became so important. So it's not just the magnificence of the Greeks; they were obviously magnificent and wonderful. But let's say that their central position within a broader network has a lot to do with it. So very basic, I think, economic factors and also mobility. So the human mobility was a massive mobility of individuals, but also of groups to warfare, slavery, migration, individuals seeking a better future and moving to somewhere else as much as happens today and especially in the Mediterranean these days. So that is nothing new what's happening today. It has happened for millennia.
There is a counterpoint that I wrote down to this idea of Mediterranean history, which comes from Jonathan Hall's History of Archaic Greece, the 2014 edition at least, when he talks about historians being obliged to use all the evidence available, and therefore if you're trying to write a genuinely Mediterranean history, you come across the problem that the weight of evidence, of literary evidence for Greece, is so much heavier than everywhere else, at least in this early period. Obviously there's a shift Italywards later on, that you're always going to be imbalanced in favour of Greece if you're taking in all the evidence. In this book, or the second edition that I was looking at, came out around the same time as Broodbank's book, and of course Broodbank, largely being in what we would call prehistory, doesn't have that same problem, but we do have unbalanced evidence across the Mediterranean. We have a problem that a lot of North Africa hasn't been explored archaeologically or is not as well known than the sort of southern European countries. But it's the same sort of problem as with the Black Sea about getting the evidence.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very valid point you make. So one of the issues indeed is that, well, everything, let's say, going westwards in the south, so we have Tunis, but everything going to the west, current Algeria and Morocco, we hardly know anything about that. We don't even know whether there were many cities, whether they were settled, whether they were not settled, because hardly any research has been done. And should more research be done, our picture could potentially change dramatically. And I think another area that has not been taken into consideration enough might be Spain, given the importance of metal deposits that obviously attracted Phoenicians. One of the earliest first millennia networks that are expanding are obviously the Phoenicians going towards Spain to extract or at least trade for metals. But how that evolved throughout the archaic period and the importance that had on the development of networks, I think Etruscans, this whole kind of West Mediterranean network that obviously becomes very important later on in the first millennium, is also something that I think has not been studied enough, not in the least, because as you say, we don't have the written evidence. And even today, 21st millennium, the written evidence and the traditional historical narratives really still determine a lot of our research questions and the way we perceive historical developments. So as much as I like the Greeks, I think we need to put them into their context, their broader cultural context in the Mediterranean, but also in the Black Sea and the various populations, Anatolia or even Egypt, Near East, that obviously all contributed to this broader network that became so important and really constitutes a proto-global world, as scholars now realize.
I think that there is a real bias problem in Western Mediterranean studies, because especially for people coming out of like a classics background, when we talk about the Central and Western Mediterranean, so many people get focused on either the Sicilian Greeks or the Etruscans, because those are traditionally, especially in Anglophone literature, those are the cultures of the Central and Western Mediterranean in a lot of people's minds. I think that has biased research against Spain, against parts of North Africa, and even I think you can extend it to southern France.
Absolutely.
I mean, aside from Massalia, I do think that a lot of evidence from southern France has either been neglected, poorly published, or just not even sought, which is very problematic.
And also Sardinia, which has its own pretty spectacular first millennium civilization, but as someone who's been focused on Greeks, I know hardly anything about, apart from what I've read in Broodbank's book, with the Nuragi city castle creations. It's really not my area, so if someone else wants to fill people in on those, that would be great.
Being a Greek archaeologist in Italy, I do know a little bit about the Sardinians, and I know that in Italy it constitutes an important field of research. There's a lot of interest in it. But then again, that's the issue, that it's only in Italy. So one of the problems is also, I think, that in the West, and probably also in the US, many programs focus on the classical civilizations because that attracts people, and these programs actually maintain these problematic notions of classical civilization and highly civilized Greeks and the Romans, perhaps a little bit of Etruscans. They're fancy too and have nice too, so we can talk about that. But indeed, the very important contributions of other groups, of other civilizations, are very much ignored. And that is actually, I think, well, not even invention of a certain tradition, but perhaps even falsification of history. We need to rebalance that.
I just wanted to say, you see that in Anatolia also, where everything is defined as either derived from the Greeks or influenced from the Persians, and there's very little room given basically for what you might call indigenous developments, or whether or not we should at all speak about this kinds of influence from one culture to another, or whether we should speak more about the general koine in Anatolia, where there's influence going both ways, as there is ample evidence for that too, when you especially look at the supposedly Greek cities on the western coast of Asia Minor and on the islands, where there's usually also a very strong Anatolian component, where people also speak bilingual languages, where there's lots of influence going back and forth. So it's very, when you come to this sort of stuff from a classical background, there's very much a tendency to see everything like, oh, this derives from the Greeks and that derives from the Greeks.
Yeah, well, one of the issues is also identity. It's very difficult to determine people's ethnic identities. So we obviously have a lot of discussion about ethnic identity the last 2 decades, but it remains a problem that, apart from some written sources, mostly in the 5th century, 4th century, there are hardly any statements about how people thought about themselves in terms of identity. So one of the results is that we put everything under the same name of Greeks and perhaps Romans and some Etruscans, but the reality was much, much more complex, and many, many, many more identities, and even multiple identities that people might have had. We can usually not know anything about them unless they were explicitly written down, which only happens in exceptional situations.
The advantage of a book like Broodbank's existing, though, is that means, so this book came out in 2013, so I could only set it for about 2 classes that I taught, but I could set chapters 9 and 10, which cover 1300 to 500, and that's like 140 pages of this book. It's a huge amount of reading, but you can set that to students and say your focus has been on the Aegean, the Greek world at home, some Italy, a little bit of North Africa, because we normally do Cyrene and not Gratis. But then reading through this, you pick up details of other things. And then if you are setting this book to undergraduates as they go on to do master's courses, perhaps they can start to think, well, I will look into these other places that are perhaps more the focus of the countries where they are. I understand the same thing happens in Spain as in Italy. There is a lot of research in early Spanish archaeology within Spain that doesn't get read very widely outside of Spain. So you can, hopefully, in teaching undergraduates, get them interested in this broader picture rather than keeping the focus on Greece and Rome, as it so often is.
Yeah, no, I totally agree that for me is the main contribution of the book. Not that it provides all-encompassing knowledge about the Mediterranean and everything we wanted to know about it, but just providing this broader context and also linking up certain developments in areas that we might easily overlook just because of the disciplinary boundaries.
And the linguistic boundaries also, as you just mentioned. I mean, the most research in Spain gets published in Spanish, but also in Russia it's in Russian, and in Turkey it's in Turkish. So that's a bit of a problem.
It is too. In the 21st century, still a huge problem, of course. Yeah, who speaks all the languages, even of all the cultures involved in our proto-global world? It's impossible.
It is, I don't want to say disappointing, because I understand why scholars want to publish in their native language, especially when it's either excavation reports or similar things related to their country. But while finishing up my Carthage book, I will admit I had to familiarize myself with Spanish enough to be able to read it, because there are some very good Punic scholars in Spain who only publish in Spanish. And while, again, I really do appreciate why they do that, it limits the impact of their work in, I think, Northern Europe, the US, and Australasia, which is very disappointing, because I think there is a lot of insight to be gained from people who are currently less accessible to most scholars, and especially to most students.
I would add to that a level of disappointment in undergraduate courses in the UK that encourage the learning of ancient languages, but not modern languages. And obviously, being able to have some grasp of Latin and Greek is essential to studying any historical period. Having some grasp of modern Greek and Italian is also very useful. So in my thesis on early Greek burials with weapons, there are plenty of publications that are only in the archaeological reports that are published in Greek, and I grasped enough Greek to read those, because you have to. It's more difficult with the longer texts, but there were also German for classicist classes that help you to master the linguistics, master the vocabulary you need to read German books. There was not, at that time, a modern Greek for classicists. I believe that did exist for a couple of years more recently, but it is sort of something that would be useful at an undergraduate level if students have time. As it is a necessary part of courses in other countries. This is a very specific UK problem I'm talking about here.
No, I wouldn't say just in the UK. I studied in Belgium, and then even in officially trilingual countries, so we have officially Dutch, French, and German as our languages. Even in our country, it poses problems in the sense that some students don't have enough background to read academic texts. So I think it is a problem in basically every country. So most students have a very good level of English, but all other languages, even French and German today, are very problematic. And then we're not even talking about Italian, Spanish, or Greek, or for that matter, Russian, which is also an important language, but I think very few people have the courage to start studying it. And I confess that it has been on my list for a very long time. But it being a very difficult language, I tried Duolingo, but I confess it's too complex as a language to study it like that. So yeah, indeed. Background is definitely one of the difficulties that scholars face when trying to study such a broad topic as even the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. And if we want to go even further east and include the beginning of the Silk Road, we are facing even more.
There are some more notes that I had from the introduction, which is sort of these three ideas that Horton and Purcell discuss with regards to the Mediterranean are fragmentation, in that it's often split into small units around the edges. Uncertainty of climate, in that the rainfall is very irregular, and you have periods of surplus and periods of drought. And then connectivity, in that it is, broadly speaking, quite easy to get around. So that is sort of the baseline layout of the Mediterranean that they are dealing with. And then from there you get how people actually interact and what they exchange.
Yeah, and what comes from the interaction, like one of their claims is that we shouldn't look at cities as a coherent and monolithic body, but as fluid networks that come and go based on the flows of people and trade that go through it or avoid it based on the fragmentation and the temporary state of everything. So that's one of the things that Horton and Purcell, I believe, want to point out is the the continuous fluidity, both in geography but also chronologically. So they have a very ahistorical approach in the sense that there is no evolution from point A to point B that they wish to describe, but within the landscape, an ever-changing pattern of interactions that goes within the specific setting of the Mediterranean and its landscapes and its climate.
So what you have throughout, or in Broodbank's book, there is a sense of this building up, although it waxes and wanes. You have people moving around the basin, and the numbers of people moving may increase, and the influence of that does increase. And then for the periods we in particular study, around 1200, you will see a decline in the amount of moving around, but it never actually stops, as far as we can tell. Certainly not on a wide level for very long. So Greece becomes more isolated for a couple of centuries, or parts of Greece become isolated for longer than others. But in the Near East, with the Levantine coast, you still have constant moving around, constant connections with Egypt, even as it sort of declines in its outward connectivity itself, and the greater inclusion of Italy and Spain.
It's interesting that around 1200 you have an isolation in Greece, because in Italy around 900-ish, and the dawn of, I guess, what we're still calling Proto-Villanovan and Villanovan culture in at least some circles, you have a slight isolation from the rest of the Mediterranean, but then you have deeper connections to Central and Northern Europe developed at that same time.
But
which,
also Sardinia.
yes, also with Sardinia.
9th century, 10th, 9th century. But also one of the most dynamic regions of that period, as it turns out, is the North Aegean. So northern Greece, southern Macedonia. So very recent research is hinting at actually the opposite trends from what we know in Greece. So in Greece, we see that there's isolation, a reduction in the number of settlements. We know reduction in the size of the settlements, whereas in the North Aegean, it turns out that there might have been even an increase in population. Settlements become larger, and there's really a huge amount of movement going on. We know of the first transport amphory, 10th century BC is the date. So you see that there are very important developments, and we don't really know yet how that lines up to the developments we know in Greece, what's really going on. But sites like Lefkandi, for example, have evidence that not only points to very important networks with Cyprus, and via Cyprus to the Levant, but also has important contacts with the North Aegean, as we see in the presence of certain types of jewelry, the use of certain motifs, like the spirals we know from the north. So there is definitely something going on. And in the fill of the Tumba building, there are also some shirts that are probably part of these transport amphory we know from the North Aegean. We don't really know where these transports come from, but they were probably produced on different sites. At least, I mean, I was lucky enough to hear one of my colleagues talking about it last week. So research is really very much ongoing in that area. But I think we might expect very, very exciting results about this part of Greece.
I seem to recall that in the cemeteries at Lefkandi, or at least in the Tumba Cemetery, we've emphasized, our research has emphasized the connections with the Near East, but you are as likely to find material from the North Aegean as you are Near Eastern objects in these graves. It's been hasn't had the same emphasis because the things aren't as shiny, maybe, but even some of them, the gold is. But it is as important. And what we see in Greece with this sort of 12th century collapse is actually partially a reorganization of emphasis, in that the sites that do well, your Lefkandi, in the Argolid, Tiryns, Andacini, and Knossos on Crete, these are all coastal settlements. They're the settlements that can get to the sea. And you see it also in the Aegean Islands, and you have these connections to Cyprus. So it is, in many ways, that network, those maritime connections that are helping people out in this period. And later on, just within Greece, as you get into the Archaic period, the late 8th, 7th centuries, the next sort of big flourishing site is Corinth, because Corinth is the one that's on the Corinthian Gulf, which takes its name from Corinth, which is the sort of maritime connections that makes it easier to get west to Italy, where the emphasis is partially now lying on those maritime connections. And it is, in early Greek history, these connected sea settlements that really flourish.
But also in the south of Italy and Sicily, so what we call Greek colonies is really part of an expanding network, overseas network, involving exchange of objects, of migration of people, but really, I think, very deep economic and also political transformation that really have a long-lasting impact, in the sense that cities grow within the course of a couple of generations. You really see transformations from small settlements to sites that we can call cities. And some of them even with management of space. I wouldn't say regular settlement patterns, as some scholars wish to say, but at least management of space and attribution of functions to certain areas within the settlement for public engagement, for burial. It's a really very, very new development, so very important. And these developments were there to stay. And it's not just the rise of the cities, but all the things that go with it. Development of politics, so the rise of the city-state, which is also needed to this period. The introduction of writing, which is also a phenomenon that coincides with it. Later in the 7th century, the development of written law. So these are really massive transformations that some sort of come out of this maritime connectivity.
Yeah, these ideas, like writing is a good example of something that not only strengthens these structures, or not only is a new development, but is something that relies on this connectivity, in that you have the ideas of coming from the Phoenician settlements, and you have Phrygian and Greek writing, and then Etruscan, and the idea is spreading along these same networks and being reinterpreted at each stage to suit the needs of each location.
But I think one of the important things, at least in terms of economic transformation of the whole phenomenon, is that we probably start out with elite interaction, which is something that has been very much stressed for, let's say, 10th, 9th, earlier 8th century. But towards the later 8th, 7th century, we see production of consumer goods, the massive availability of drinking vessels, the production of transport amphorae to ship wine from one part of the Mediterranean to the other, really indicate that there is a huge social transformation going on as well. So it's not just the 1% and the rich and the wealthy that enjoy this Mediterranean culture, this elite culture, but also ordinary people that try to participate in it and try to adopt this luxury lifestyle. That also contributes to, let's say, the cultural transformations we see in the consumption of wine. So the Greek symposium, even though that's a really very general name for let's say, I think a broader group of drinking practices, but at least, having the right vessels and drinking wine and reciting poetry and inviting your male companions to come over, and in some parts having women to entertain your group. That really became important, and everyone wanted to participate in it. So that also had a massive impact on culture. Whereas previously, I think Bronze Age up until early Iron Age, it was really somehow only the rich and the wealthy that would do this.
I wonder if we couldn't say, though, that what we consider to be more of the common people were still involved all the way back, at least to maybe 1000 or 900. Just thinking about Etruria, or the area that would later become Etruria, and some of the recent ideas about the importation of craftsmen and things from Central and Northern Europe. And, to what extent should we be saying that those people are playing a part in this globalizing culture? Obviously, if they were brought in as slave labor or something, they still do contribute in their own way, in a very unique way. And I think that we should still consider them as participants, even if they weren't necessarily consumers as much as the elite would have been.
I was just thinking, I have a note in the end of chapter 8, I think it was, of Broodbank, where I've written, networks are linked together and objects can travel through them. This is not the same as people moving, there are different redistribution patterns, which I think means that we have, when you look at 10th and 9th century Lefkandi, you have these Near Eastern objects of faience and quite beautiful objects in graves that have metals and weapons and seem to have been higher up elite burials. And that leads us to the conclusion, or so that means what we can see are the elite interactions. That's the most visible part of this. Whereas the actual movement around of people, who actually is getting these objects from where they started to where they end up, we don't see that as much. And the evidence we have to go on is where these things were produced, where they ended up. That's the link we can see. We can't see all the other places they may have gone along the way. We can't see who is doing it. We can't know if what we're seeing here are elites who stay where they are and get stuff from people who are traveling, or elites who actually go out and do this traveling. So the difficulty we have is the visibility of who's moving, who's visible in the archaeological record generally, and one of the things we see from the 8th century onwards is an increase in that kind of visibility. And so that's why it seems to be, and because of that increase in visibility, we also see an increase in quantity of people moving and probably intensity of the connections, which means we have to assume it's a larger group of people doing these connections. And some part of that may always have been slaves as well as lower class craftspeople, but how, as things become more visible and more intense, you can start to tell that that is what's happening.
It's obviously a very difficult question, because we don't really know to what extent people were free to move around, in what ways people had possible relations of bondage to certain, let's say, overlords, masters. If you were unhappy, let's say, or were poor, were you actually allowed just to pack your bag and move overseas? Or were you forced, for example, to go with your lords overseas? I mean, these are questions we can't really touch upon because we don't know anything. And we rely on written sources. And the result is that we have this very traditional idea of Greek colonization and founders, and then we all have all kinds of stories about hunger and expeditions that have been set up, and then mostly royals inviting half of the population of their city to set up a settlement overseas. But the reality does not really confirm these kinds of stories. So, but what actually happened is still very much subject of our research today.
When we think about people sort of packing up and moving, we can think about that in two ways. In that, if you're living in a settlement and you're unhappy or unable to make a living there, packing up and moving to the neighbouring settlement might be possible for anyone. Getting on a ship and sailing somewhere requires you to have access to ships. Travelling long distances requires you to have vehicles or a way of surviving over a long distance. That we don't know how restrictive that was, but we can look at things like the burial from Argos with we call it the panoply burial, although it's not really a panoply, that has the bell corselet, which might have been cut off at the waist for sitting on a horse, but also this burial has a pair of fire dogs in the shape of a ship. So bronze fire dogs. So these are graves, wealthy graves. So you do have this symbolism connected with transport in wealthy graves. You also early on get dedications of wheeled vehicles or models of chariots at Olympia. And a question there could be, is this to do with how you're getting to these places that are sort of out of the way or not near a major settlement? So only the people with that kind of transport can get there. And then you have Hesiod, who was terrified of crossing the sea to Euboea, which is 37 meters wide at its sort of narrowest point, to get to Halkis. So you have a few bits of evidence all over the place that sort of give you an idea that some people were scared of moving. Other people were proud of moving, and that perhaps this kind of transport was restricted in some way, or at least the ability to do it relied on access to certain vehicles. So you can say that within the 7th century, when, depending on how you date Hesiod, all this evidence comes from, we've got certain evidence that suggests transport is restrictive, but also possibly becoming more available. So when you get into things like the so-called colonization, you've got to ask whose were the ships they were traveling on, how available were ships, who is helping these people move, which I think are they might not be questions we have the answer to yet, but they are questions we can start to look into about how people are getting around.
Yeah, when you talk about access to vehicles, you don't just mean people owning ships and chariots, but we're having the social relations, let's say, with people who do have access to that, or being able to buy access to that. So it does suggest sort of more the higher end of society, or people who had something else to offer, of course. I mean, you can also trade. You could say, I can help row your ship in exchange for you taking me to somewhere.
Yeah, and the sort of point there is 8th century is the period of the Pentecosta, so you need 50 people to row those ships, is the idea. I believe actually you don't need that many people.
No, there are also ships for 20 rowers, and there are sailing ships too. So,
but certain ships need crews, so you do have the rowers who are going places, and the question is, who are these rowers as well?
A related issue is also property of land. Could people just go to a city and acquire a plot of land? It's something we don't know much about. Who owned the land? Could you just go somewhere and offer your services? For example, rent a piece of land and just pay a certain percentage to the owner of the land? Or could you go to a settlement, a city, and set up a workshop? I think our evidence suggests that offering labor or hiring labor became easier, in the sense that the fact that we see so many people moving, objects moving, suggests that there are some changes, I think, at least in the organization of labor, the organization of ownership of the land, that allows people to be more mobile, to be less restricted in their movements. in the choices they make in their life, but it's very difficult to point these things down and like really say how this was organized, because we don't have any written evidence. And again, for archaeologists, yes, it's very difficult to say something very specific about organization of daily life. We usually see things over a broader time frame, but what actually happens between two people or a small group of people, that's very difficult to understand. And we actually need exceptional evidence to start talking about these kinds of issues, if we ever consider them. That's not really sure.
But the development of coinage might be an interesting thing to look at in that respect, because the earliest coins tend to be fairly large denominations, and as time goes on and they become used more, you get smaller currencies basically that are really used in day-to-day transactions.
Numismats don't really know why coinage was developed. The idea is that it wasn't actually developed to facilitate trade. The denominations are too large, they're too different, so if you want to conduct trade over a large area, you would need one type of coinage, not different types of coinage. So one of these suggestions has been that coinage was developed to pay mercenaries. So people you hire to fight in your army, and then you just give them a lump of silver or gold or whatever to fight for you. Although other scholars doubt it. To be honest, there hasn't been a real solution to the problem. So
I think for Carthage, the emergence of Punic coinage in the late 5th century is the consensus is that it was to pay mercenaries, but obviously that's a much different situation than in the Aegean, because it emerged much later, and they were mostly, I think, fairly usable denominations that Carthage began striking in the late 5th century.
Yeah, by the classical period, you have regular currency, basically. It's just at the beginning where you have the first Lydian coins. They're all these electrum coins and large denominations and that sort of stuff. They were probably used for... I've also read that it was suggested to make it easier to pay for temple construction or temple repairs and that sort of stuff, or to dedicate it to the gods or whatever. So, but initially not to pay mercenaries would just be if you hired a guy who had a large following, you would say, I'm going to give you this many talents of electrum or gold, and it's all neatly stamped with the official seal of the king or something. That slowly this changed into a concept where you had smaller denominations for day-to-day traffic, basically. But that's really later.
Yeah, so we see that actually in the archaic period, there was a lot of trade going on without coinage. There were no shops where you would go and buy, I don't know, an amphora and 2 cups, at least in the earlier period, as far as we know. So how these objects make their way to their consumers, we don't really know. It's very much a topic of current research.
Yeah, and a lot can be done with barter, as we also saw with the economic crisis in Greece, where loads of people reverted back to a barter system, and it worked perfectly fine. So you don't really need coins either for day-to-day exchanges, strictly speaking.
Yeah, but I mean, even in daily life in the Western world, there are still a lot of transactions going on, or services you can solicit for free from friends or neighbors or family members, like things like you're going to move. Okay, you might actually pay someone to do the job, but very often people actually have, let's say, social power over certain people, family members, friends, neighbors, to ask them to come and help for this. And then, you would get pizza or whatever, or beers. And this is actually very much an ancient world system, in the sense that anthropologists point out that feasting, consumption of beer or wine, was usually related to this kind of soliciting labor from people, and then as a reward they would get alcohol or consumption or objects or whatever. Even today in the Western world, these systems of interaction, of exchange, still exist. So we think we're modern, but Brunner Latour was very right in saying, "Nous n'avons jamais été modernes." We have never been modern.
Broodbank sort of finishes with these 4 questions for the later Mediterranean, like empires, the extension of hinterlands beyond the basin, the development of a common material/cultural vocabulary, and world-changing breakthroughs. And I don't know if you want to just consider those. So before 500, we have empires in the Middle East, but it takes some time before you get an empire that can actually control the Mediterranean. And this, I suppose, is a Roman thing that I don't really feel qualified to talk about. But the more integrated this network becomes, the more capable you become of controlling it.
To an extent, I think the argument's been made fairly well that Rome was an exception in many ways that made it successful in controlling the entire Mediterranean, especially the Roman perception of citizenship that gradually developed from the archaic period forward was so important in that. I don't want to sound like a Roman exceptionalist in that. But.
Well, it is obvious that the Romans managed to develop certain techniques that made them very successful, at least for some time, which probably might even have been beyond their own nation. A whole series of wars, the development of an infrastructure that actually allowed the integration of vast regions. So not just I'm thinking about roads or management systems, but also religion, cults, political, administrative tools that allowed them to expand and at least for some time keep the network intact, or at least minimally intact, to have different nodes communicating to each other.
And another aspect of this is with what we see in this within Broodbank's book in this period that we all know about is this sort of the increase in intensity of these networks, the increase of settlements, without having really discussed colonization, but that's part of the reinterpretation of the so-called colonization, is that what we're seeing is settlements springing up that sort of facilitate these networks. And by the time Augustus is conquering Spain and sort of completing the Roman Empire around the Mediterranean, the population along these coasts is such that it is possible to control them in that way. It's very difficult to cross the Mediterranean, or impossible to cross the Mediterranean without being in Rome, and yet that is the main way of getting around the Mediterranean. So it's part of this whole process of increasing connectivity is that means it becomes possible to have something like central organization.
Centrality was really important in the past as it is today. So earlier we talked about Athens being really a central node in a network that spans the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, but also Rome. Recent research has illustrated how Rome was already in the late Bronze Age, early Iron Age, in the center of a network in Latium and Etruria that allowed it to expand. And obviously there were the right mechanisms in place to manage the expansion, but the centrality of Rome as a physical location was really important and a key aspect of its success. As Rome expands through time, it obviously developed the right tools to manage this expansion, but the fact that it creates a centrality and expands its centrality was really part of its success. So all roads lead to Rome, and that was very true and was necessary for Rome to keep its importance.
And of course, its centrality is part of being the center of the Mediterranean. In sort of that Rome-Carthage axis is the sort of center of that basin.
Yeah.
The second of Broodbank's 4 questions for the later Mediterranean is the extension of hinterlands beyond the basin, which I suppose this is sort of Alexander going further east, but also we can sort of see places like Massalia, which go up into Gaul/France. This has always been the case in Egypt, going up the Nile towards its source. So going beyond this connectivity by sea and up into connectivity across landscapes, I suppose. This is the shortest one of his points. It's 1 paragraph.
Which is, I think, a crucial one. However, I don't think we should underestimate the connectivity over land. Yes, road networks existed in Greece, in Italy, already in, late Neolithic, Bronze Age, throughout. You clearly see it. I'm thinking about a site like Sala Consilina, for example. It's really in the middle, in the mountains in Italy, and the amount of material that comes from north and south inland. It can only get there by way of foot or perhaps on a horse or something. But that really shows that even early on, connectivity over land was also very important. Well, perhaps also a reason that connectivity at sea was successful just because of the hinterlands, that some sort of thought to establish a connection to the connectivity that already existed overseas. So one of the things that scholars point out within this so-called Greek colonization is also the huge amount of mobility that existed in native societies. So we shouldn't just think about Greeks and Phoenicians coming in from overseas, but also populations from inland moving towards the coast or moving around more inland.
And there's a part of this where by connecting to those pre-existing land networks, what the groups moving around the Mediterranean, which broadly Greeks and Phoenicians, are actually doing is connecting up these separate networks in their own area. There's a point Broodbank, or a line Broodbank has in his introduction, where he says about a mountain and a sea and deserts can all be barriers or highways. If you have the right technology to cross them, then that's a highway. That's something you connect across. If you don't, then it's a barrier. And it is changing circumstances change what's a barrier and what's a pathway. So yes, you do have these overland connections that are very important, and partially we've flipped in a way following Horden and Purcell into focusing a lot more on the Mediterranean and its ease of access, and thought a lot less about the overland routes. But if you talk about Olympia, which is in the middle of Peloponnese, it's a land node compared to Delphi, which is inland but on the Corinthian Gulf, or Delos, which is the middle of the Cyclades. That's a very important site that you have to get to by land, as well as many others. So yeah, it is important to focus on both of those kind of connections.
Yeah, as you point out, is where the two networks come together, and the fact that different networks lined up and actually manage to attach themselves to each other and function together. And that is, I think, a huge success and a huge impact that the first millennium BCE saw is this innovation. Obviously it existed some sort of probably already in the Bronze Age, but on a much lower scale. I think it's the scale really that is new in the first millennium BCE.
Yeah, and what the point that was stressed before is that there can be many links in a chain. I mean, an object from Egypt that ends up in a Sardinian grave doesn't have to necessarily have been transported by one person from Egypt to Sardinia, but could have been at all sorts of different routes to different areas before ending up where it finally ended up to be discovered by archaeologists.
Well, just think about amber traveling down from Baltic, Scandinavian areas down to Mycenae, and then we're talking about Bronze Age. So that's really striking. So being now in Denmark, I was just yesterday in the famous Moosgård Museum looking at Bronze Age material here in Denmark, and just already the level of connectivity between Scandinavia, Mediterranean, over the Carpathian area is just amazing. So we're very astonished about this thing happening in the first millennium, but it's actually a trend that continues the overland connectivity that existed since the early Bronze Age. So it's certainly not something new, and I think that's really a point that scholars will be talking about more, like this very early globalization that we now realize is not something that happened in the last couple of centuries, but it is really something that human society has been experiencing, I think, since it settled down.
It's worth pointing out probably that, we've been talking a lot about especially Broodbank and his book, but there are people who are working on the overland connectivities, and the one that always comes to my mind is Christian Christensen. And I think it's really important that especially Mediterranean archaeologists start looking more at Central and Northern European work in our discussions of the globalizing first millennium or second millennium BC.
World system theory was what Christian Christensen, I think, introduced into archaeology, or at least Central European Bronze Age archaeology. So no, it's definitely not a new point. Although our understanding, I think, becomes much more nuanced. So obviously, this idea of world systems was criticized in the sense that it left out local appropriations of a global culture. So there was not much room for agency in Christian Christensen's representation of interaction. Whereas I think now, with the gradual adoption of post-colonial theories, I think about the work of Michael Dietler or Peter van Donnellan, that scholars look at both sides of the coin, in the sense that, okay, there were these global developments, but also the local impact that global developments had, which were obviously very important to take into account, because otherwise you start to have very generalizing stories about what is going on that do not really reflect local developments.
This leads quite nicely into Broodbank's third question, which is the development of a common material or cultural vocabulary. So many of these material traits that are sort of brought together in the early first millennium start being adopted as a common vocabulary across the basin. And so we start to see like similar symbolism, similar ideas used across the basin, which has often been considered Hellenization, but is perhaps more local use of cultural ideas that are widespread.
Well, let's think about the late 7th century, the Oriental period in Greece and Italy. So it's actually the adoption of many Levantine models, which I think has not been acknowledged enough, that it is really a Levantine model that is dispersed throughout the Mediterranean, with infusions, obviously, of local customs. So the Greeks definitely were their vessels. But again, very much following, I think, Phoenician model. So, for example, Corinth develops this very flourishing industry of pottery production. Part of it are drinking vessels, so the kotilai, the onochoai, but a lot of it is also perfume bubbles. And that is following a development we know much earlier in the Levant. So global trends, but very much in a local fashion, and the same way the drinking habit. So some scholars like to talk about the spread of the symposium as a sign of the presence of Greeks within the Greek colonies. But if you really look at the archaeological record, you see that it's much more, it's still about the transformation. It's in the course of a couple of generations, 2-3 generations, you really see that local populations adopt habits of consuming wine and obviously having the fancy vessels, the right vessels. You would have a jug, an oinochoe, to pour your wine and have the right cups with fancy decoration, consume it. And some sites also have a crater, which seems to be something perhaps typically Greek, to mix your wine with water. But that is not something that happens overnight. So it actually takes a couple of centuries before people adopt these practices. And even if they adopt the practices, they don't adopt the whole set. So it's very much, let's say, a giving and taking and selecting what people like. Also combustion. So some areas might actually have used some of the vessels for drinking beer, for example, because wine was not always widely available or only available for the richest. people, or might have come in on a seasonal base, for example, in summer when ships were able to transport wine, but probably at a certain point in the year, your wine might have been finished, and then you would obviously resort to other kinds of alcohol consumption.
World-changing breakthroughs of the classical Mediterranean, the ideas of the individual, society, and politics, and the transcendent, and the relationship between them. Oh, I don't know how much we can get into this, but it is sort of, why do these great ideas come out of the classical Mediterranean?
It strikes me as like you're saying, the classical Mediterranean is this thing, distinct from everything else, but obviously it flows from everything that's come before. So I mean, also in Greece itself, in the Bronze Age, you have these kingdoms, as far as we can see, and then in the moving towards the first millennium, you get all these city-states with various forms of government and that sort of stuff. So it's a very long process behind there. So I think he sort of answers it himself, basically.
I don't think it's a very novel idea, because you have, of course, the notion or the concept of actual age introduced by Karl Jaspers, who see similar developments, not just in the Mediterranean, so Greco-Roman world, but also points out that roughly at the same time, first millennium, you have very important developments in China, in Persia, in India. So I wouldn't really say that the Mediterranean has breakthroughs that stand in isolation, although again, we don't really know the connection between the developments of these phenomena, how much people actually exchanged ideas that led to development at the same time in different cultures. But obviously, important things developed, and things like cities or writings or even political ideas were there not to go away anymore. At least, well, to a certain extent in the Middle Ages. Some things got lost, but not to the extent that it was completely lost and forever gone. And that is something very important.
Yeah, there is a book edited by Arthur Cotterell from the 1990s called the Encyclopedia of Classical Civilizations, where they try to make that point exactly, because you have classical Greece, Hellenistic Greece, the Roman Republican Empire, but you also have the Persian Empire, developments in China and also in India. And their argument is basically that between 500 BC and AD 500, you have like this band across the globe where you have all these large civilizations in quotes, that all rise and flourish, and that have broad similarities between them, all developing in more or less the same period of time.
Well, the idea of development of philosophy that points to, let's say, an awareness of individuality among humans might not have existed before ever in time in any culture. So there is definitely something going on in the first millennium BCE. There's, I think, little doubt about that.
And we'll wrap up there. Thank you so much for listening. If you want to learn more, please visit our website at ancientworldmagazine.com. We've also recently started a Patreon campaign. If you like what we do and want us to do more, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/ancientworldmag. That's Ancient World Mag as one word. Special thanks to E.M. Thomas for supporting us, as well as our undying gratitude to our other patrons. See you next time.